From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, which is the library's reading and literacy promotion arm. And I'm happy to welcome you to one of our noontime talks about new books that have special relevance to the Library of Congress. And this is how we kind of define the Books and Beyond Noontime series. The Center for the Book itself promotes books and reading not only here in these talks, but also through the National Book Festival. How many people here were at last weekend's, or was it 2 weekends ago? The National 2 weekends ago National Book Festival, which this year moved to the Convention Center for the first time with pretty good results. And so we're evaluating that, and the book festival itself is certainly a going concern. And I'm hoping that we can remain in the Convention Center, as a matter of fact. We also have state centers for the books in all states, which are hosted by different kinds of institutions, but wherever they are and however they're hosted, their job is to stimulate public interest in books and reading and literacy in libraries in their states. All of our Books and Beyond talks here at the Library of Congress are filmed for the library's website. And so I'm asking you to please turn off all things electronic. And we will have a format that includes a chance for questions and answers and some discussion with our author. And so please be aware of that, if you involve yourself in that, you have a chance of also being part of our website broadcast. We will also have a book signing. I'm delighted that this beautiful book has arrived just in time. Our speaker last night was at Politics and Prose, as some of you know, and he tells me the books had just arrived the day before at Politics and Prose. So we are in luck, and the book will be, it has a price of $35, and we're selling it at the Library of Congress price today of $30. So I hope you take advantage of that. And the timing is such that we will need to move to the book signing no later than 1 o'clock, depending on how the questions and answers go. I am very pleased to be able to introduce an old friend, Ezra Greenspan. Ezra is, and I'm going to read this out now, the Edmund J. and Louise W. Kahn Professor of English at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. He holds a PhD from Brown University, and when we first met, Ezra was teaching at the University of South Carolina, and the vehicle through which we've known each other is the organization called SHARP that many of you, I hope, know about or hope you are members. SHARP stands for the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing. And that Ezra came to the 2 SHARP meetings that the Center for the Book has hosted at the Library of Congress. The first one was the second year of SHARP, and I can't come up with the date for certain, but I know the last one was 3 years ago. And here in Washington, when we collaborated with a number of other organizations and had more than 250 scholars who were interested in the history of books, libraries, and the history of reading. Ezra has been the editor of Book History, which I meant to bring an example of it, which he has co-edited for many years with Jonathan Rose, who is another scholar who was in on the, or actually Jonathan, I think we call the founder of SHARP. And it's a remarkable international organization that really has come a long ways in promoting the history of books and the history of print culture. And Ezra will be giving another talk this afternoon to our Mid-Atlantic group that is in charge of book culture, or not in charge of, but studies book culture, and that talk will, a little bit more on the archival side of things, will be at 4 o'clock held in the Kluge Center. Ezra is, among other things, a Whitman scholar who in 1990 published Walt Whitman and the American Reader, and in the year 2000 he published a biography of the publisher George Palmer Putnam, which was always of interest to me because Herbert Putnam, who was the Librarian of Congress from 1899 until 1939, was George Palmer Putnam's sons, one of his sons, right, Ezra? But Ezra is on to a very exciting topic that he's going to share with us today. He's done some pioneering research on the important and versatile 19th century author, writer, William Wells Brown, and it's my pleasure now to present to you Ezra Greenspan. Ezra, let's give him a hand. And we'll sit right here.
Thank you, John. It's a delight to be back at the Library of Congress. Those two books that John mentioned, the books on Whitman and G.P. Putnam, were Library of Congress books. They could not have been done had the spectacular collections of this library not been available. I'm not going to say this in a sour way, don't misunderstand me, but one can't write a biography, by contrast, of William Wells Brown by relying on the Library of Congress. We have a number of his books here, but Brown, like most African-American figures pre-20th century, is elusive, hard to find, difficult to track down, and in part, the lack of a central archive was really the central problem. There are other problems as well, but that was a crucial one. That's just by way of preface. If I have time, I'm going to circle back to Washington and give you William Wells Brown's view of Washington from the 1850s, before the Civil War. But I'm very happy to be here. The Center of the Book is a wonderful institution. I really feel at home coming back here. I'm going to read fairly formally for, I think, about 10 minutes, and then more loosely get to a slide presentation, which I think is the more interesting part. But there's a little bit of work that needs to be done, and I can do it more effectively if I read from script. When we talk about the lives of great American writers, Franklin, master of the press, offspring of the Platonic conception of himself, father of the city that he adopted before it adopted him as patron saint, Whitman, son of a broken family, 6th grade education, master of self-promotion, incarnation of the body electric, Melville, another 6th grade dropout, wandering sailor, no show at Harvard or Yale College, but graduate of the School of Wales, Dickinson, daughter of difference who rose to no man's requirements, mistress of self-reliance, the only kangaroo among the beauty, Thoreau, bachelor of nature, enemy of conformity, lover of himself, Twain, riverboat pilot, Confederate Yankee, self-educated with a major in humor and a minor in contrariness. We think of lives that were unprecedented, unpredictable, unscripted. Yet, outlandish as these lives are, none can quite compare with the life of William Wells Brown for sheer implausibility. Brown was the master of the implausible. For the full account, I invite you to read the 600-page biography, but for today's purpose, you need only an introductory sketch. William, as he was known in his earliest years, we don't even know his familiar name, Bill, Billy, Will, Willie, we don't know, was born in 1814, this is his bicentennial, but raised on the Missouri frontier on a farm in an area associated with Daniel Boone. He was really raised in Boone country. He spent his teens rented out as a contract laborer in St. Louis, working chiefly and most memorably on the first generation of Mississippi and Missouri River steamboats. Miserably unhappy, especially as his family members were sold off one by one, Brown staged 3 escapes from his masters during his St. Louis years. On the 3rd attempt, initiated as he disembarked his master's steamboat at the public landing in Cincinnati on New Year's Day, 1834, he finally gained his freedom and ran northeastward across Ohio towards Lake Erie. Illiterate, in all likelihood, certainly functionally illiterate and innumerate at the time of his escape, he quickly made himself over into a new man after settling in Cleveland and later Buffalo, where he used his unschooled, hard-earned literacy to make himself, over the next 5 decades, the most prolific, pioneering, and accomplished African-American writer and multimedia figure of the 19th century. His many books include the first known African-American novel, published play, European travel book, history of black military service in the Civil War, and anti-slavery songbook. His fugitive slave narrative is one of the seminal works in the genre. The anti-slavery moving panorama he took on tour across the British Isles in the early 1850s was a major achievement in the history of African-American visual arts, and his 3 histories of the African-American experience earn him the position of the leading historian in the field during his lifetime. Although we may today see him as the first African-American literary professional, he actually led a high-profile, multidimensional professional life as a public speaker, anti-slavery and civil rights activist, temperance reformer, and medical doctor. That's a bare-bones sketch of Brown's life. The plan of this talk, however, is to focus not on the life, but on the reconstruction of the life as a biographical project. To do that, I want to take you behind the scenes on a biographical journey. Writing biography is always a journey. Sometimes it's a multiple-stage journey. And this one occurred through selected archives. For my purposes, in search of a major writer and social activist who disappeared largely from public view for a century after his death in 1884. So this project was, at least in part, a project of recovery, specifically about Brown in its larger dimensions, because I tried to write Brown into the larger American context. His life demands that. It's too big and too seminal and important not to be treated that way. And so it was a recovery project on a fairly large scale, not to say that there hasn't been a great deal of work done on many of the topics that I work on, but to bring Brown to the center, to my mind, was an absolutely crucial part of the project. The fundamental research question concerning William Wells Brown is, how does one access his life? How do you get at him? Even to recent literary and cultural historians, Brown has proven one of the most elusive figures in the entire field of American literature. As 2 of the leading 21st century scholars of African American literature, Anne DeSille and John Ernest, have posed the question, where in the world is William Wells Brown? There's no easy answer because there's no central archive. There virtually never is for members of any pre-20th century minority groups. The standard sources biographers work with, personal libraries, manuscripts, letters, albums, scrapbooks, memorabilia, almost never exist. Not even for Brown, author of numerous books that were widely reviewed, frequently reprinted, and whose name was frequently in the news. As a younger man, 5 years less senior than I am today, I initially had high hopes of finding ample new documentation. I was young and naive. After 5 years of diligent work, I've not found a single family letter written to or by Brown, or with one exception, to or by any other member of his family. And actually, there are 3 different families that Brown had over the course of his lifetime. That's part of the personal story, which I'm not going to be talking about today. I don't even have a single specimen of the handwriting of his second wife, and I've seen only one useful specimen of his literary manuscript, and that a couple of cheap sheets of paper that came to light 2 years ago by serendipity. But for all the difficulties, there was a way to locate William Wells Brown and his world, or the way that I thought of it, William Wells Brown in his world. I thought it has to come together. And I want to retrace with you some of the steps my wife, Ricky, who was a central part of this entire project, and I made in pursuing his legacy over the course of 5 years in trips covering thousands of miles across the US, Canada, the British Isles, and Ireland. Our journey began in June 2009 when we packed up our home in Dallas, loaded up our car, and set out on a 14-month research trip with home base located at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. We took the long route getting there, following a trail that tracked along the northern arc of Brown's life, which for us included visits to archives in Missouri, Michigan, Ontario, all across New York State, and a long trek across England before we settled into our sabbatical home in Worcester. Our first stop was Missouri, where Brown spent nearly all of his boyhood and adolescence. What we were looking for, I realized only later, was our trailhead, the point of entry along a trail I could not, at the time, identify. I couldn't even see my way. I couldn't find the main trail through the narrative. It was something that had to be discovered as we pushed forward. And this is, I think, is not uncommon for difficult biographical projects. Driving from Texas northeastward and dodging a tornado as we entered the Show Me State, we made our first stop in Columbia at the Historical Society of Missouri, but made little headway. That is, until I happened to notice hanging on one of the library's walls a decades-old Missouri State Highway map. In examining it closely, I noticed that the town of Marthasville, a place that resonated in my memory, was located more or less on the way to St. Louis, our main destination in the state. So after a couple of relatively fruitless days of research at the Historical Society, heading eastward towards St. Louis, we cut off the interstate, drove down a country highway, and wound up at the following spot, totally unaware that we had arrived at the trailhead of this biographical journey. Notice the date is important, Marthasville, 1817. We parked, I think you can actually see behind the signage, there's a little parking lot, and I can't make out whether that's our car. It may be. We had no idea where we were, except that we were on the edge of the town of Marthasville, basically a farming community of about 1,000 people today. And as we walked from the car, we saw historical signage around this municipal park everywhere. And that's really the first part of the story, and I'll get to it in just a moment. But let me just mention, this is the Katy Trail, which is part of for a Dallasite, this should have registered as an omen. The Katy Trail is the old Missouri, Kansas, Texas railway right-of-way. And on the other end, it passes within about a mile of my office at SMU. The railroad doesn't exist anymore. This is now a public trail, lots of walkers, runners, bicyclists, and I will say on the near side toward me, about half a mile from this spot, is the graveyard in which Daniel Boone was originally buried. He's since been reclaimed, bones and reputation, by the state of Kentucky. Now, take a look at some of the signage. First of all, there's a little bit of the narrative of this area. What I want you to notice is behind me, there's a restored cabin, which you're going to see more closely in a second. The path, it's actually a paved road by it, has additional historical signage, and that signage, it turned out, became a crucial part of the entire biography. All of this completely by surprise. That's the restoration, one more view of it with the plaque. What it makes clear is that this was a reconstructed cottage dating back to 1804. It was put up by the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Committee of the local area, commemorating the fact that Lewis and Clark, on their voyage of expedition westward, began, in effect, their voyage after leaving St. Louis. They came to this particular town before it really had entered its American phase. And here is one of the historical signs right by the cottage, and it gives the history of this area going back to the French period. Remember, it enters the U.S. as part of the of Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Previous to that, it was French-speaking. The name of it was La Charrette. By the time Lewis and Clark got there, it was Charrette Village. And the sign gives the early history. So light bulb number one went off in my head. This is Lewis and Clark territory. This is a story about the westward frontier, about manifest destiny in the next generation. But another interesting piece on the signage at the bottom is the fact that this was also Boone country, that Rebecca Boone died at the home of her daughter, Jemima Calloway. Jemima Calloway was married to a man named Flanders Calloway. That's of minor importance. On the backside of the same sign, we have the American version, the town now called Marthasville, and the explanation that it was settled by a man by the name of Dr. John Young. Dr. John Young was the master and owner of the young William Wells Brown. So this is not just Lewis and Clark country and Daniel Boone country. This is William Wells Brown country. And as you read the history, starting with Young's purchase of the land, it was a very big purchase. The death of Daniel Boone at the home of his brother-in-law, his son and sister-in-law, Young's sale of the land in 1826. What you'll notice is absent is any mention of the name William Wells Brown. This was the situation as we saw it in the summer of 2009. So, three major pieces of historical information: Lewis and Clark and the narrative of American progress; Daniel Boone, the great figure of the American frontier, and it's still to this day Boone country; and third, Dr. Young's presence and William Wells Brown's absence. And I realized this has to be the trailhead, and this is a major part of my story. It's a biography of a young African American who grew up on the American frontier, who would spend his early years as an adolescent on the first generation of American steamboats. This was somebody with really an extraordinary background. I don't know if you can read it all the way in the back, but here's another really interesting little piece of information. The red arrow is pointing to the information. It says Charrette Village, adjoining the land of Flanders Calloway and James Bryant. I think Bryant is a misprint for Bryan, who was the son-in-law of Daniel Boone, but more to the point, Flanders Calloway was Boone's son-in-law. And if Rebecca Boone died in the cabin of Flanders Calloway, and another piece of information made it clear that Boone lived for part of his last 6 years, 1814 to 1820, in Flanders Calloway's house, well then, William Wells Brown grew up next door to Daniel Boone. I looked hard for physical evidence of what that area looked like. Of course, the most wonderful but non-existent photograph would have been a likeness of the Young cabin. But this is Flanders Calloway's homestead. No date, I don't know when it was taken. It looks to me to be 19th century, but this would be very close. Young's house would have been much larger and much fancier. A year later, Ricky and I, after a year or 8 or 9 months in Worcester, on our drive back to Dallas, we're now in the summer of 2010, decided that we would come back via the southern route. And that was primarily an attempt to find both the white and the black sides of Brown's family. Brown's father was a white man, and we found his father. We found out a lot about him. We found Dr. Young, who was a first cousin of the father, and we looked very, very hard for Brown's mother, Elizabeth, and that, I have to say, was a labor of ultimate frustration. We thought very close in Virginia. We think she was born in Virginia, but we never found her. In any event, we decided on the last day of that 13-month trip that we would return. It was kind of rounding a circle, that we would return to Marthasville. And by this point, I mean, how does one write a book like this? One relies on a lot of professional friends, librarians, archivists, scholars, and we, by appointment, met up with the director of the local historical society, that's Kathy Schoppenhorst, as well as the head of the Missouri State Archives from St. Louis, Mike Everman, and his wife Diane, a professional archaeologist. And by the time we met up with them in July of 2010, we realized that we were standing the whole time, the moment we got out of our car the year before, all the land around, the place of the restoration, the municipal park, the parking lot, the cornfields all around, and the town of Marthasville on the top of the hill, that all of this was the original John Young estate, which is to say, the moment we got out of our car, we were walking on the same land on which William Wells Brown had spent his childhood. So we came back, we hoped to see what we could see through the eyes of professionals. And so Ricky's taking the photographs. Here we are walking the grounds. And it probably hasn't changed all that much. The lower lying land, this is very fertile land. It's very close to the Missouri River. Midsummer, lots of corn growing. So we walked the land looking for marks, like survey marks, of the original plot. Here we are further along, and I'm afraid not much really to see. A restoration, this is actually in the center of Marthasville. We did find some of the original spots where Young owned property in Marthasville. We don't know where the original house was. You know, I suppose that somebody with supersonic technology, you know, maybe Henry Louis Gates could get an aircraft to fly over this area, you know, with sensory devices and find, you know, where the bones, you know, of the historical past were. We did this, you know, the hard way. And just to update the historical narrative, because we are talking about one of the pioneers of African American history, 4 years later, I think thanks to Kathy Schoppenhorst, the they've put up a new sign. This went up in the last 4 months. Sorry, it's not a very good photograph, but finally, in the year of his bicentennial, William Wells Brown has entered the official narrative of Marthasville and Missouri history. I'm going to skip over a segment. Sorry, we just don't have enough time. I want to talk a little bit about archives. That was our first archive, in a manner of speaking, the remains of a physical location and the narrative that got attached to it. William Wells Brown spent 5 years in England, technically as a fugitive slave, from 1849 to 1854. While in England, he brought out an Anglo-Irish edition of his narrative. He brought out a new edition of his songbook. He wrote the first African-American travelogue 3 years in England. And he wrote and brought out the first African-American novel. He was a busy man. All of that he did on the side. He was the best-known African-American lecturer in the British Isles in the 1850s. He was a phenomenon. The reason he went in the beginning, besides his sheer interest in spreading his wings, was that even though a non-citizen, technically a non-person in the United States, he was an official delegate to the Third International Peace Congress meeting in Paris, France. And while there, he was one of the most electrifying speakers there. He made some very important contacts. One was with an English aristocrat by the name of John Lee, the strangest kind of an aristocrat who leaned left. And Lee, who was, by the way, a cousin of the Lees of Virginia, including Robert E. Lee, took a quick interest in Brown and invited him, when they got back to England, as well as some of the other delegates, to come visit at his country estate about an hour north of London. And here you have a measure of a life, a person born in a slave shanty in the bluegrass country of Kentucky, an honored guest at one of the finest mansions in all of England. This, by the way, was the site of Louis XVIII's court in exile in the early 19th century. It's an absolutely magnificent house. The back view. What makes it most interesting, and really the reason that Ricky and I went up there, was Brown mentions in his travelogue that Lee had his name inscribed on a brick, and the brick installed, Lee was one of the leading amateur astronomers in the British Isles, in the vault of Lee's observatory. It was the firmament of great people. I don't know who the other folks were, and we were hoping that we would actually get a chance. We had to figure out how to get into this house, but once we had done that, get a chance to see this remarkable testament to the young William Wells Brown. Well, it turns out everything we looked for physically in England from Brown's period, just about everything no longer existed. This great house suffered a major fire in the early 1960s. They restored it, but they had no reason to restore the observatory, so that part was gone. We figured, though, it would have been the corner that abuts outward on this side, on the left side. And now, very quickly, I want to circle back to the United States and to Brown's view of Washington. And as I said, it's not an entirely happy view of our nation's capital in the 1850s. While in England, Brown had Washington on his mind. He read the American newspapers. He knew what was going on with the Fugitive Slave Bill. It basically meant he was staying in England for a good long time. He couldn't come back, too well known. And so he dug in and did quite a lot of writing. Two particular works by Brown that relate to the portrayal of Washington, and they're both very interesting and very powerful. Brown produced the first African-American panorama that was shown in the British Isles. A panorama was an enormous narrative painting done on heavy canvas, rolled up on scrolls, and presented in a way that might remind one of moving pictures. It was a form of visual technology that basically was the precedent to, the predecessor to moving pictures. Brown apparently commissioned 250 yards of canvas in 24 views, and he would perform. He would show it at night in a dimly lit room. He would often sing. He was a wonderful singer, and he would tell the story. One of the 24 views was his view of Washington. And basically what Brown was doing was rewriting American narrative history from an African-American point of view, as well as the visuals that went with it, turning them into a kind of visual art that was suitable for the presentation of African Americans and African American history. These are enormously ambitious tasks. Virtually none of the old panoramas has survived, but Brown's had a catalog. So we know from the catalog what the panorama, what the 24 views looked like. One of them is very reminiscent. For those of you who have seen 12 Years a Slave, you may remember that the director made a point when Northup is being held in a Washington prison of cutting out and showing the tops of buildings with the top of the Capitol sticking up to give the viewer a sense of the proximity, in a manner of speaking, of slavery and freedom, the problem of American democracy. And that was one of Brown's scenes, but Brown's is even richer. Brown's takes place in 1848 when there's a mass celebration in Washington of the revolutions for freedom that had broken out across Europe. And in the backdrop are the slave pens. And for Brown, this was the correct way of presenting American history, and especially our nation's capital. At that point, Brown had never been to Washington. He would come actually only after the Civil War. He was the general agent of the Freedmen's Monument to Abraham Lincoln. The other visual work that Brown produced, this may be familiar to at least a few of you, is the famous illustration from his novel Clotel. Clotel, the story, the fictitious, but not entirely inaccurate story of the slave daughter of Thomas Jefferson and Jefferson's slave girl, Sally. At the end of the story, Clotel returns to rescue her daughter held in Virginia, is recaptured, sent off to Washington to be held in a slave pen until she can be transported back to her master in Mississippi, escapes the slave pens, runs across Washington, and is running across the long bridge from Washington to Alexandria. She's cut off on both ends, and in desperation, as this illustration shows, jumps to her death. For William Wells Brown, historian of America and the African American experience, Washington, D.C. was the nub of the problem. And from his perspective, remember he's still in London, unable to get back to the United States, this was the situation in the United States through the 1850s. And perhaps I should close on a more hopeful note. As I mentioned, after the Civil War, Brown would come to Washington for the first time, and he was, I think it was in 1867, He came to Washington, Maryland, and Virginia. He met officials, he took in the city, he met the African American community, and he went out into the country to meet the real people, his people, the people he'd grown up with, for the most part, in Missouri. And he came away enormously optimistic. And as general agent of the Freedmen's Memorial to Lincoln, thought this was the proper way that we can pay respect to the great emancipator. That actually was a project that had a very complicated history. But Brown eventually came around to seeing Washington, as we say today, is Washington the problem or the solution? William Wells Brown would say, yes and yes. Thank you for your attention.
Time for a few questions, Ezra. Do you want to just repeat that?
Yes.
So how did you, until today, I've never heard of William Wells Brown. So how did you discover him, and what led you to take on this task of, uncovering his life and trying to put together these little bits of information, to put his story together?
Can you repeat
And
the
thank you
question?
so much for doing so.
This is a question I've been asked many times as I was working on the project. Why write a biography of Brown? And, I think the way you're posing the question leads to part of the answer, that this was a life story that needed to be written. This was an absolutely amazing life. In one sense, Brown was the most inventive, cultural, creative figure in the United States in the 19th century. And I'm a lover of Whitman. I've put in a lot of time on Whitman. But Brown did more things in more ways. And that's part of the answer also. I knew of Brown as the author of Clotel. American lit scholars have known about Clotel for a long time. When I read his play, his historic play, The Escape, I was absolutely stunned. It was, to my mind, to my sense, immediately one of the best American plays of the 19th century, and almost totally unknown and almost totally unstaged, except when, in his own life, Brown took it on the road and did one-man recitations of all the roles, all the white roles, all the black roles. So I thought, all these works by one person, a narrative of a life, one of the most amazing lives of the 19th century. And, you always have to ask yourself, is this something that I can do? Does it fit my skill set? And then I guess the final ingredient was his sensibility spoke to my sensibility. In a basic way, I get Brown.
As far as his writing was concerned, what degree of formal education, if any, did he have? Was he self-educated?
Right, no formal education. We think he was functionally illiterate when he escaped at the age of 19. So by our standards, when our kids are off in college, Brown could not read or write. I'm going to be in Lexington, Kentucky next week. Lexington believes that Brown was born there. That's unfortunately not correct. Close, but not correct. And I'm going to be speaking at a number of high schools. And I think one of the things I want to say to the kids is, everybody here reads and writes. You have prospects, but Brown, by contrast, like the vast majority of American slaves, was illiterate, and in spite of a prodigious intelligence, extraordinary capacities, he was a victim of slavery, and in many regards a typical victim. And so part of the question for me as a biographer, once he escaped, was how did he educate himself? How did he get educated? And there's no real evidence. You have to make a lot of guesses And the answer that I came up with, which I'm pretty happy about until the negative criticism starts coming in, I may have to rethink this, but I think two things happened. Part of it was self-education. This was a young man just bursting with creative energies, and he wanted to learn. And he had that inner spirit. But the other part, which I think was actually also typical among African Americans freed or self-freed from slavery, was he was educated by the community, the people around him. And there actually is one tiny piece of evidence that Brown was taught in part by his wife. He married a young woman in Cleveland within 6 months or 8 months of his escape. And I think it was a communal enterprise, common, that African Americans helped one another in many ways, but one chief way was to become educated. And so I did look for things like, I looked up every African American in the city of Cleveland. There were only 50 or 60 when Brown got there in 1834, and looked for philanthropic self-help organizations in Cleveland. And in fact, African Americans were trying to start a school. So I think the story is partially one of individual initiative, and the other is communal responsibility.
Thank you. I have a quick question for you about the archival sources that you used. Were there a lot? What did you find, and where were they located? Were they in Kentucky? Were they in Ohio? Because it sounds like there wasn't a lot of traces left to find.
They're never enough, first of all. That's just the way it is. About the questions about the archival sources, how ample they were and where they were to be found, because there were no central archives, and because Brown presumably, this was an important research question, what happened to Brown's archive? Brown was one of the best read African Americans in the United States. He read prodigiously. He must have had a large library at home. He was a professional writer for 40 years. He went from book to book, and he updated them, which meant that he was probably using earlier editions as manuscript copies. He had a prodigious correspondence. He was well known, lots of friends, interesting friends. What happened to it all? And the answer is, we don't know. But the necessity, therefore, was to go everywhere that there were Brown associations. Also to research his friends and colleagues. And I said earlier that I tried to write Brown into the larger context. There are powerful reasons for doing that, and one was that was Brown's basic premise. I mentioned Whitman. Whitman thought of himself as utterly exceptional, and his exceptionalism allowed him to turn himself into a representative figure. It's a paradox. Brown never thought of himself as exceptional. He thought of himself as an African American. And so what he wrote, even how he wrote, was part and parcel of being one of a people. And therefore, a way to get at Brown was to go through the lives and sometimes the archives of his fellows. The obvious figure is Frederick Douglass. And Brown and Douglass are lookalikes in many ways. They're both white father, black mother, exceptional, prodigious young people, authors of two of the great fugitive slave narratives, print-based figures, public speakers, and in fact, they often worked in concert. So I would work, if I couldn't go into Brown through the front door, I'd have to find an alternative way. And a lot of that meant just going to archives wherever Brown lived.
How about the Douglas papers? I mean, did you find much in the way of correspondence?
Well, we are at the Library of Congress, and the great archive in the field is the Frederick Douglass papers. And the relationship, I found scattered bits and pieces. It's actually a little bit disappointing. There are no personal letters. And by the way, a personal letter from Brown to Douglass would be, "How dare you?" It would start with an antagonistic statement. Douglass and Brown had a very difficult relationship. In some ways, it shouldn't be surprising. These are big men, and when big men or big people get into a room, there's just not enough oxygen to supply two major breathing apparatuses. But there were professional connections. Brown probably began his European travelogue as a series of letters that were written first to the North Star, Frederick Douglass's paper, and then when that switched over to the paper called Frederick Douglass's paper, they were in a professional relationship. That was probably the first stage, and then Brown probably figured, these are really good, and I can turn it into a book. And there are documents relating to that. And there are a couple of scattered letters. One of the coincidences is that the family that bought the freedom of Frederick Douglass, a family from Newcastle in England, was the same family that bought the freedom of William Wells Brown. Their name was Richardson. These were remarkably fine people. Ellen Richardson is a really remarkable human being, and both Douglass and Brown were very close to Ellen Richardson. And Richardson's correspondence with Douglass is here in the Library of Congress. And when she wrote Douglass, she often associated Douglass with Brown and would ask, what's new with my old friend William, who hasn't written me in X number of years. So, there are some very small but very cherished moments.
Any other questions? Let me ask one more, and then we'll do the book signing. When I saw Ezra earlier today, of course, I was thinking, and I'm telling him now, that a number of people who are here are associated with the Daniel Murray connection with the Library of Congress, which is the name of our staff association. And so I had to ask Ezra a little bit about Daniel Murray, and the original book I had was the publisher's advance copy, and I just got it yesterday, and I hadn't looked, it had no index, and so I looked today, and there was something about Daniel Murray in your book. Do you want to say just a few words about Murray and his significance, and a little bit about, do you think they ever met?
I don't think Brown died in 1884.
No, they
too early, but this really raises the question. For me, Murray was a way of finding a central figure in the history of the reputation of African American literature and culture. And of course, the date of the Paris Exposition, 1900, was very nice. I said in my introduction that Brown's reputation faded virtually into obscurity after his death in the 1880s, and the reason was Jim Crow. That's an overstatement. Brown's reputation remained alive in the black community. And Daniel Murray was very much aware of Brown and Brown's peers. This was an amazing generation. Brown, Jacobs, Tubman, Garnett, Delaney. One can go on, and they're all born within 5 years of each other. And it's the same generation that gives us Melville, Hawthorne, Whitman, and one can go on. We know what happened to the reputation of white writers, that they became canonized. For me, Daniel Murray was a way of trying to figure out what official status did African Americans have as Jim Crow was taking over the American North and the American South. The Library of Congress was a bit of an asylum, a haven from much of that. In any event, I wanted to know what books did Murray take over? You know, what African American monuments were going to be put on display? And remember, the idea was to put them on display in 2 national capitals, in France, and then bring them back to the Library of Congress and put them on display in Washington.
For the exhibition of 1901?
1900, the
1900,
Exposition, the great
right.
French exposition, one of the world's greatest World's Fairs. And he took 5 titles by Brown. Brown had written over a dozen books. And this was interesting too. What part of the African American experience did Murray want to present in Paris? And interestingly, he did not take many fugitive slave narratives, for example. I don't believe he took Douglas's. I'd have to check that. He certainly didn't take Brown's. He did take Harriet Jacobs, but he didn't know Harriet Jacobs' real name. But that was a moment where people like Du Bois and Calloway and Murray thought, this is our opportunity. And unfortunately, it was a very short-lived moment of brilliance. And, you know, as far as I know, Murray's collection didn't even come back to the Library of Congress whole. Part of it is now at Howard, for example.
Well, that's true, and I was telling Ezra, one of my first jobs when I came to the Library of Congress was to sort out, and I was an intern before the Center for the Book was created and interested in collection development, and I was asked to help sort out what was then called the Colored Author Collection that was the leftover part of the Murray collection and with these labels across them. But I did it in conjunction with a wonderful woman named Dorothy Porter at Howard, and the agreement was that if we came across duplicates that Howard wanted, they went there, and so I was part of that. And the other part of it was to take the wonderful pamphlets that somehow had come back from Paris and index them and put them as the Murray collection in the Rare Book and Special Collections Division. So they are bound together in several different volumes, but it's, and that's what's left of the heritage in terms of materials, but of course his heritage lives on through the association and the fact that there's now new scholarly interest in Murray. And you mentioned to me a book that someone had done about the exposition, and I know of someone who's now doing and I have wrote a letter of recommendation for her fellowship of a full biography of Murray and his family in Washington, and the role that family played, you know, in terms of what is a form of, the author thinks of a, you know, black elitism in a way, but it has to do with the families and the growth of Murray in his family, and it's not as much about Murray at the Library of Congress as I would like to see, but maybe she'll get to that as well. So I'm glad that at least we've introduced the topic again, and we can follow up on it. Well, please join us for the book signing outside, but in the meantime, join me in thanking Ezra Greenspan for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Tom.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.